I'll never forget the first time I saw the yard. It wasn't a market in the traditional sense, no stalls, no cheerful haggling. It was just a stretch of cracked dirt and weeds behind the abandoned church on Hollow Street. People called it the trading yard. No one owned it, but everyone knew its rules. Bring something valuable, take what you need. It started during the worst of the bad years. Factories had shut down, stores were boarded up, and families stripped their homes bare to scrape by. I remember walking there with my mother once, carrying a chipped porcelain vase she'd inherited from her grandmother. She traded it for a bag of potatoes and a threadbare coat. That was the way of things. Nobody questioned it. But the yard had shadows. Not the kind cast by the broken steeple or the twisted trees looming overhead. Shadows in people. A desperation that made you forget your morals. People brought heirlooms, wedding rings, even furniture. But none of it compared to her. The old woman came late in the evenings, long after the rest of the traders had packed up and shuffled off. She was stooped and swaddled in layers of filthy gray fabric that hung off her like cobwebs. No one knew her name, but she became known as the Bone Lady. I first heard about her when my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, started wearing this weird necklace. It was a single bone, pure white, shaped almost like a finger. She claimed it was a relic, sacred and blessed. She said she'd traded her last jar of preserves for it, but swore it brought her luck. "Since I got this," she said one day, "I haven't gone hungry. Doors open for me. It's like, it sees what I need." I thought she was crazy, but she wasn't the only one. The story spread, and soon others were wearing her bones too. Pendants, bracelets, even keychains. They all swore by them. Holy relics, they called them. Pieces of the ancestors. I didn't buy it until the night I saw the trade. It was late, later than I should have been out. The yard was quieter at night, eerie under the faint glow of a sickle moon. I'd gone there to trade a dented frying pan for some candles, but most of the traders were already gone. Only a few lingered, huddled in whispers or scurrying away with whatever meager deals they'd struck. That's when I saw her. The Bone Lady was standing at the far edge of the yard, her hunched form barely visible under the flicker of a gas lantern she carried. She wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize, a wiry guy with sunken cheeks and jittery hands, stood across from her. He was holding something wrapped in cloth, cradling it like a baby. His knuckles were bone white, and even from where I stood, I could see his lips moving, though I couldn't make out the words. I crouched behind a pile of broken crates and watched. The Bone Lady didn't speak. She didn't have to. She just stood there, her lantern swaying slightly in the cold breeze. When the man finally unwrapped the bundle, I saw what he'd brought. A dusty violin, its strings frayed but still intact. It looked old, valuable even. The kind of thing someone might sell if they had no other choice. But she didn't take it. Instead, she reached into the folds of her tattered shawl and pulled out a bone. It was small and smooth, shaped like a bird's wing. The man stared at it, his fingers twitching. She held it out to him, and for a moment he hesitated. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he reached out and took it. The moment his fingers closed around the bone, his entire body stiffened. His head snapped back like he'd been electrocuted, and a horrible, guttural sound escaped his throat. A cross between a gasp and a scream. He dropped the violin, clutching the bone so tightly it looked like it might snap. And then, just like that, it was over. The man stumbled back, panting, his face pale and slick with sweat. The Bone Lady tucked the violin into her shawl and turned to leave. "Wait!" the man croaked, his voice raw. What happens now?" She didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. She just shuffled away, her lantern flickering until she disappeared into the shadows. I stayed frozen in my hiding spot for what felt like hours, my heart hammering in my chest. The man eventually staggered off in the opposite direction, still clutching the bone like his life depended on it. When I finally worked up the nerve to go home, I told myself I'd imagine the whole thing. But that night, I couldn't shake the sound of his scream. It echoed in my head, long after the rest of the world had gone quiet. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The man, the bone, the way his body jerked like a puppet on tangled strings. I wanted to forget, to write it off as some strange coincidence. But the stories kept coming. Mrs. Carlson, with her bone necklace, started acting off. At first, it was little things. She stopped talking to the other neighbors, kept her curtains drawn tight even during the day. Then came the noises. Late at night, people heard her pacing her house, muttering to herself. Someone said they heard her laughing, this shrill, high-pitched sound that didn't seem to belong to her. And then, she started digging. Her backyard became a maze of shallow holes and overturned earth. Looking for relics, she told the mailman one day, her smile too wide, her eyes too bright. They're here. I know they're here. Nobody dared ask what she meant. I tried to tell myself it wasn't connected. Just a coincidence. But the yard was changing too. More and more people were trading with the bone lady, and it wasn't just small trinkets anymore. I saw a man haul in an entire dresser, its wood polished and gleaming. Another woman brought a sewing machine, her face pinched with worry as she handed it over. Each time, the bone lady would reach into her shawl and pull out another bone. Small, smooth, perfect. And each time, the person would take it like they couldn't help themselves, like they needed it. But what struck me most was the aftermath. People who traded with her seemed different. Not happier, not healthier, but possessed. They'd clutch their bones obsessively, muttering prayers to them under their breath. Some even stopped coming to the yard altogether. Their houses would go dark, their gardens overgrown, until it was like they'd vanished off the face of the earth. And then one night I saw the man again, the one with the violin. It was a week after the night I saw the trade. The yard was quiet again, and I was on my way home from scavenging scraps when I spotted him. He was standing in the alley beside the butcher shop, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I wasn't sure it was him. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollowed out like he hadn't eaten in days. His clothes were filthy, and his hands trembled as he clutched the bone, the same one the bone lady had given him. He kept rubbing it, over and over, his fingers tracing the smooth surface like he was trying to wear it down to dust. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored him, pretended I hadn't seen. But something about the way he was muttering to himself made my stomach twist. "Hey!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "You okay?" He whipped his head around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. For a moment, I thought he might attack me. But then he laughed. This low, broken sound that made my skin crawl. "Okay," he said, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "No one's okay anymore. Not after her." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at me to run. He held up the bone, his hand shaking so badly I thought he might drop it. "It won't let me sleep," he whispered. "It whispers." At first, it was just dreams. Faces I didn't recognize, places I've never been. But now, his voice cracked, and he looked around, his eyes darting like he expected someone, or something, to leap out of the shadows. "They're not just in my head anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're here. I see them. I feel them." A cold knot of fear settled in my stomach. "Who?" I asked, my throat dry. His lips parted, but before he could answer, his gaze snapped to something behind me. His face contorted in terror, and he stumbled back, clutching the bone so tightly it dug into his skin. "No," he hissed. "No, I won't. You can't make me." I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty alley and the flicker of a street lamp in the distance. When I turned back, he was gone. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow that flickered just out of sight, felt like it was alive. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I avoided the yard for a few days, but that only made the nightmares worse. Faces I didn't recognize would float behind my eyelids. Sunken eyes, flesh stretched thin over sharp bones, mouths that moved soundlessly as if screaming. They stared at me, accusing, waiting, and then came the whispers. It started one night when I was lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling and listening to the wind rattle the windows. At first, it was faint, like the rustling of dry leaves. But then it grew louder, words forming in the hissing sound. He took us. She freed us. I bolted upright, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. The room was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. It circled me, growing louder and more frantic, until I clamped my hands over my ears and screamed. And just like that, it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I went back to the yard, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what I'd seen, what I'd heard. But when I got there, it was deserted, except for Mrs. Carlson. She was crouched in one of the shallow holes she'd dug in her backyard, her hands clawing at the dirt like an animal. Her hair was wild, matted with soil, and she was humming this low, tuneless melody under her breath. Around her neck, the bone necklace swung back and forth, catching the weak sunlight. "Mrs. Carlson?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. I moved closer, my stomach twisting at the sight of her hands. Her nails were broken, her fingertips raw and bloody. "Mrs. Carlson," I said again, louder this time. "What are you doing?" She froze. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Her eyes were completely black, the pupils swallowing the whites like oil spreading over water. "They're here," she said, her voice distorted, like more than one person was speaking through her. "They're waiting." "Who?" I whispered, taking a step back. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile, and she raised her bloody hands, clutching something tightly. When she opened her palms, I saw it. A bone, tiny and pristine, nestled in the gore of her fingers. "They'll take you too," she whispered, "just like they took me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a tangle of weeds as Mrs. Carlson rose to her feet. She was taller than I'd realized, her thin frame seeming to stretch unnaturally under the patchy sunlight. The bone dangled from her fingers, swaying slightly as if moved by an invisible breeze. "Take it," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "It's yours now." "No," I stammered, shaking my head. "I don't want it." Her smile widened, splitting her chapped lips. "You'll take it," she murmured. "They've already chosen you." I turned and ran. The world around me blurred as I tore through the yard, the sound of her laughter echoing in my ears. It wasn't just her voice. It was layered, a chorus of deep, guttural chuckles and high, shrieking giggles that didn't belong to a single person. Followed me all the way home. When I finally slammed my door shut, I collapsed against it, my chest heaving. My house felt too quiet, too still, but I forced myself to breathe, to calm down. I told myself it was over, that Mrs. Carlson's madness couldn't follow me here. But then I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of tapping. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my bedroom. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic. Tap, 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 like bony fingers rapping against the walls. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. I crept toward the hallway, my pulse thundering in my ears. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the air grew colder with every step. When I reached the end of the hallway, I hesitated. My bedroom door was ajar, just enough for me to see the edge of my bed. "Is someone there?" I whispered, knowing how ridiculous it sounded. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the darkened room beyond. For a moment, there was nothing, just the silence pressing down on me like a weight. But then I saw it, perched on my bed, stark against the rumpled sheets. A bone. It was small and smooth, the same color as bleached ivory. I felt my stomach twist as I realized it hadn't been there before. My legs moved before I could think, and I slammed the door shut, locking it as if that would make a difference. That night I didn't sleep, couldn't. The whispers were back, louder this time, seeping through the walls and into my skull. They spoke of hunger, of longing, of debts that could never be repaid. And through it all I felt them, The eyes I couldn't see but knew were there, watching me. Waiting. I didn't leave my house for 2 days. Every creak, every shifting shadow sent my nerves into overdrive. I shoved a chair against the bedroom door and kept the lights on, though the bone stayed exactly where it was, perched on the bed like it was mocking me. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. Every time I got close to it, my chest tightened, my breath hitching as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. It wasn't just fear. It was the unmistakable feeling that something terrible would happen if I touched it. By the 3rd day, the whispers started to change. They weren't just aimless murmurs anymore. They were specific, direct, calling me by name. Maggie! I jolted upright, my heart hammering. The voice was deep and gravelly, nothing like the hissing whispers from before. It echoed through the room, so clear it was as if someone was standing right next to me. Maggie, come back. My knees buckled, and I pressed myself against the wall, my fingers digging into the plaster. No, I whispered. No, no, no. The lights flickered, casting warped shadows across the walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that didn't stop the voice. You can't hide from us. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like I was sinking underwater. I could feel them now, figures moving just beyond my vision, circling, closing in. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw the bone. It had moved. It was no longer on the bed. Now it sat on the floor, perfectly centered in the room. My chest tightened as a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and into my skull. The hum grew louder, deeper, until it was a roar, drowning out everything else. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The air was heavy with silence, so thick I could barely breathe. I stared at the bone, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, slowly, it began to rise. I froze as it floated into the air, turning slowly, almost reverently. Shadows coiled around it like smoke, shifting and writhing as they took shape. Faces formed and dissolved in the darkness, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. You took what wasn't yours, the voices said in unison, layered and broken. Now you owe. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was crouched in the corner of the room, my back pressed against the wall. My throat burned, and my hands trembled as I clawed at the plaster, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and it. The bone hovered in the center of the room, spinning slowly, the shadows around it growing thicker, darker. The faces in the smoke became clearer, sunken eyes, twisted expressions of rage and agony. Their mouths moved, but the words didn't match the sound. The voices came from inside me, vibrating in my skull like they were burrowing straight into my brain. You've seen too much. You've heard too much. You are part of it now. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were everywhere. Beneath my skin, behind my eyes, running through my veins. I gasped for air, my chest tightening as if something was squeezing my lungs. Please, I choked out. I didn't take anything. I didn't trade. The shadows surged, and the bone shot toward me, stopping inches from my face. The cold emanating from it was unbearable, like being plunged into icy water. I felt my breath hitch as the whispers changed, soft now, almost coaxing. But you were there. You saw. You belong to us now. I don't know what came over me, but something inside me snapped. My fear twisted into anger, raw and desperate, and I lunged forward, swatting at the bone with both hands. The moment my fingers touched it, pain exploded through my body, searing, blinding, like every nerve was on fire. I collapsed to the floor, convulsing, my vision flashing red. When I came to, the room was dark. The bone was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner, clutching my knees to my chest, my body aching from head to toe. My mind raced with a single thought. I had to end this. Whatever it was, whoever the bone lady really was, I had to find her. The next morning, I returned to the yard. The yard was empty when I got there, eerily quiet except for the faint rustling of dead leaves in the wind. The broken church loomed over me, its warped steeple casting a long shadow across the dirt. Felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I stood there, trembling, scanning the area for any sign of her. My eyes lingered on the far edge of the yard, the spot where I'd first seen her make the trade. The ground seemed darker there. The dirt blackened and cracked like something had burned its way through. "Come out," I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "I know you're here." First, nothing happened. But then, from the shadows of the church, she appeared. The bone lady moved slowly, her tattered shawl billowing around her like smoke. Her face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel her gaze boring into me, cold and unrelenting. In one hand, she held her lantern, the weak light flickering as if struggling to stay alive. In the other, she cradled a bundle of bones. "I didn't take anything," I said, my voice shaking. "I didn't trade with you, but they're still coming for me." She didn't respond, just tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. Then she spoke, her voice dry and rasping, like wind over gravel. "They come for all who see," she said. "All who know." I felt my knees buckle, but I forced myself to stand. "Why? What do they want? What are you doing to these people?" She let out a low chuckle, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "They do not belong to me," she said. "I am merely the messenger, the gatekeeper." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising in desperation. "Who are they?" She lifted the bundle of bones, her gnarled fingers tracing the edges of each piece. "They are the ones who were forgotten," she murmured. "The ones who were discarded. Their lives were taken, their bodies stolen, their names erased. But they cannot rest, not until they are whole again." I took a step back, my mind reeling. The bones, they're theirs? The people who take them, they're cursed. "Not cursed," she said, her voice sharp. "Bound to the debt they owe. The debt we all owe." I felt my stomach churn. "And what about you? Why are you doing this?" For the first time, she hesitated. Slowly, she reached up and pulled back her hood, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. Her skin was stretched tight over her skull, her cheeks hollow, her eyes sunken and black as the void. But it wasn't just her appearance, it was the way she moved, the way she breathed. She wasn't alive. "I am one of them," she said softly. "A fragment, a piece, and so are you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. A piece? A fragment? My mind scrambled for meaning, for any explanation that didn't involve the horrific implications swirling in my head. What do you mean?" I stammered, taking another step back. "I'm nothing like you." The bone lady tilted her head, the ghost of a smile creeping across her withered lips. "You were chosen the moment you entered the yard," she said. "The moment you saw. It's not the taking that binds you. It's the knowing." "No," I whispered. "That's not true. I didn't." "You carry them already," she interrupted, her voice rising over mine. "They are with you now. In your thoughts, in your dreams, in your blood." I felt my stomach lurch as the weight of her words settled over me. The dreams, the whispers, the bone that had appeared in my house. It was all connected, all part of whatever this was. "They want to be whole," she continued, taking a step closer. "But they cannot find peace. Not until they are complete." I shook my head violently, panic clawing at my chest. "I didn't ask for this," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't do anything." "None of us did," she said. "And yet here we are." Her gaze dropped to the bundle of bones in her hands, and for a moment her expression softened. "You cannot run from this," she said. "You cannot hide, but you can choose. Accept your place among them, or let them take you." The words sent a jolt of cold terror through me. "Take me," I whispered. She nodded slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. "They will strip you to nothing," she said. "Erase you. Leave only the fragments behind." I wanted to scream, to beg her to stop, but my voice wouldn't come. The shadows around her began to writhe and shift, forming shapes that loomed over me. The faces returned, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths twisting in silent agony. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and skeletal, closed around my shoulder. Another gripped my arm, the bony fingers digging into my flesh. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the crushing weight of their presence, their anger, their hunger. "Choose," the bone lady said, her voice distant now, muffled by the roaring in my ears. "Choose before they choose for you." I looked at her, tears streaming down my face. "What happens if I accept?" Her smile returned, thin and brittle. "You join them," she said. "You become one of the forgotten, but you remain whole. You remember. And if I don't?" Her expression darkened. "Then you are unmade. No memory, no soul. Only bone." The shadows closed in, the air thick with their whispers. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My body trembled as I stared at the bundle of bones in her hands. The fragments of lives that had been stolen, shattered, and now sought to make themselves whole again. "I don't want this," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't want to be part of this." She shook her head slowly. "It is not about what you want," she said. "It never was. I made my choice that night. I don't know if it was the right one, and I doubt I ever will. But now, when I walk through the yard, the shadows no longer frighten me. The whispers no longer haunt me, because they're part of me now, and I am part of them."